On December 5, 1943, General George C. Marshall stood at an unprecedented crossroads. Behind closed doors in Cairo, he held the very plan for the Normandy invasion he had meticulously crafted, while President Roosevelt faced an impossible dilemma. In that moment, Marshall had to choose between the personal glory he had spent a lifetime preparing for and his duty as the architect of the American Army. Why did Marshall decide at the final moment to relinquish command of history's greatest invasion to General Dwight D. Eisenhower? And what was the true psychological cost of this ultimate sacrifice? The intelligence landscape of late 1943 was a fog of competing priorities. Roosevelt and his Joint Chiefs knew that a cross-channel invasion was the only way to break the Wehrmacht, yet the British leadership, under Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, remained haunted by the specter of the First World War. They favored a peripheral strategy, bleeding the enemy dry in the Mediterranean. Marshall, however, held a singular, unshakable focus, a direct thrust into Northwest Europe. He understood that the logistical reality of maintaining a global war machine required a singular, focused administrative genius in the Pentagon. If the United States were to project power simultaneously into the Pacific and across the Atlantic, the lines of supply, the mobilization of millions of men, and the complex industrial orchestration could not be delegated to a subordinate. Logistics were not merely a background concern. They were the primary constraint shaping every strategic option. By the time of the Cairo Conference, the United States had transformed into a global juggernaut. Yet the sheer tonnage required for Operation Overlord demanded a degree of coordination that dwarfed any previous military undertaking. Marshall knew that if he left his post, the delicate balance between the European and Pacific theaters might collapse under the weight of inter-service rivalries and political interference in Washington. He viewed his role as the necessary anchor for the entire Allied cause, a burden he carried with stoic integrity. General George C. Marshall was a man who commanded absolute respect through his cold analytical candor. He was one of the few individuals who could openly challenge President Roosevelt, yet he remained trapped by his own sense of duty. He desperately coveted the field command of Overlord. It was the natural culmination of a lifelong career as a soldier. He had spent months mentoring Dwight D. Eisenhower, witnessing the transition of a career officer from a mere staff planner to a four-star general, a meteoric rise that Marshall himself had orchestrated. Yet he refused to lobby for the role. He operated under a rigid personal code. A soldier does not ask for a command. He waits to be told where he is needed most. The tension within the chain of command was becoming palpable. Within the American inner circle, there was a quiet, intense competition for the spotlight of history. While Marshall remained stoic, others in his orbit watched the evolving situation with calculating eyes. Eisenhower, meanwhile, existed in a state of professional anxiety, fully aware that his mentor's potential transfer to the field would displace him or relegate him to a subordinate role. The psychological pressure was immense. Each man was operating under the assumption that the supreme Allied commander would be the individual who would eventually occupy the White House. The relationship between Marshall and Eisenhower was fundamentally one of master and protege, yet the impending decision was poised to break that hierarchy. Marshall's reputation, built on decades of administrative perfection, stood on the brink of being tested in the field. He feared that his absence from Washington would lead to a fractured war effort, yet his heart remained with the units he had built. He stood at the center of a storm of his own creation, balancing the global political demands of an alliance with the raw, visceral ambition of a career soldier. When the Big Three finally met at Tehran, the question of the invasion's commander became the fulcrum of the entire conflict. Joseph Stalin, impatient and cynical, directly challenged Roosevelt and Churchill to name the man who would take responsibility for the Western Front. This was not merely a military query, it was a test of Allied unity. The logistics of the landing were already strained, with landing craft shortages and inter-Allied debates over landing sites. But the appointment of a supreme commander was the necessary political signal to satisfy the Soviet demand for a second front. The ensuing arguments between the British and Americans became personal. Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, having long expected the command, was devastated by the shift in the balance of power. He viewed the American assumption of command as a rejection of British expertise, yet the sheer scale of the American contribution to the European theater made the decision mathematically inevitable. Marshall watched as his political superior, Roosevelt, struggled to maintain the fragile ego of Churchill while simultaneously answering the blunt, uncompromising demands of the Kremlin. The intelligence reaching the leaders was often faulty or misread, with reports on German coastal defenses shifting daily, complicating the strategic assessment. The decision to appoint an American commander was ultimately driven by the logistics of the landing itself. Whoever controlled the flow of supplies and the allocation of the fleet effectively controlled the invasion. Marshal recognized that the discord between his own military staff and the British planners was creating a bottleneck, a logistical nightmare that only a single, decisive authority could resolve. Yet the dilemma remained. If Marshal were to leave, would the logistical coordination of the global war effort shatter? Or would his presence in the field guarantee a swifter, more efficient victory in France? The debate over the Normandy command became a crucible for the entire Allied leadership. In the weeks leading up to the decision, the corridors of power in Cairo were filled with the hushed, intense arguments of men who knew that their choices would be scrutinized by history. Roosevelt found himself in a delicate position, forced to weigh the immense logistical contributions of the American military against the pride and legacy of his British partners. The pressure was relentless. Marshal, though quiet in his demeanor, remained the focal point of these discussions, his very existence as a potential field commander acting as a silent, powerful factor in every negotiation. British commanders, specifically Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, were profoundly frustrated by the evolving reality of the coalition. They argued that the American focus on a direct cross-channel assault ignored the tactical realities of the German defenses in France, a position they defended with vigor during the Tehran sessions. They viewed Marshal's insistence on a single, massive invasion as an American-led gamble that risked the entire war effort. For Marshal, the friction was not just a matter of strategy, but of fundamental command philosophy. He believed that the British were too wedded to a strategy of attrition that would only prolong the misery of the continent. The intelligence factor added a layer of profound uncertainty to these debates. Information regarding the integrity of the Atlantic Wall was fragmented, with intelligence analysts struggling to distinguish between authentic German reconnaissance reports and the elaborate deception campaigns intended to mask the true strength of the coastal fortifications. Commanders in Washington and London were essentially gambling on the quality of their intelligence, and the disagreements over the viability of a landing were driven by this fundamental lack of clarity. Marshal had to decide whether to trust the projections of his junior intelligence officers, who warned of hidden panzer reserves, or to press forward with the optimism demanded by his political masters. Amidst the high-level maneuvering, a subordinate voice, the junior officer or staff aide, often observed the strain that the senior leadership refused to acknowledge. Some staff members recorded their concerns in private diaries, noting that the political maneuvering between the Allies was creating a vacuum where tactical realities were being obscured by diplomatic expediency. These junior officers, closer to the logistical reports, understood better than their superiors that the available shipping for the invasion was insufficient for the ambitious plans being drafted in the relative comfort of the conference rooms. Their warnings were consistently overruled or ignored, as the political need for a unified front took precedence over the logistical constraints on the ground. Psychological pressure weighed heavily on every commander involved. Exhaustion from years of managing a global war began to distort judgment, leading to impulsive arguments and a loss of the precise, analytical focus that had defined the early months of the conflict. Roosevelt, in particular, was visibly weary, his health failing even as he navigated the most critical strategic choices of his presidency. Marshal, although disciplined, felt the acute pressure of being caught between his desire to lead in the field and the undeniable fact that his absence from Washington would leave the American machinery of war without its most effective pilot. The clash reached a breaking point as the logistical realities of the operation forced a final, irreversible sequence of events. The sheer volume of equipment, the coordination of naval assets, and the integration of diverse national forces required a level of administrative mastery that was the rarest commodity in the war effort. It is a common misconception that the decision to choose Eisenhower over Marshal was primarily driven by a desire for a popular figure or a lack of confidence in Marshal's field abilities. This is historical fiction. The reality was purely logistical and administrative. Roosevelt realized that he had only one man capable of managing the totality of the American war effort from Washington, and that man was Marshal. As the air in Cairo grew heavy with the heat of the approaching winter, Marshal and Roosevelt moved toward their final private meeting. The stakes were no longer just about a landing on the coast of France. They were about the survival of the Allied command structure itself. Eisenhower's role in this transition was one of quiet, immense professional strain. He knew that his mentor's desire for the command was genuine, yet he also understood the necessity of the position he was being positioned to inherit. He handled the uncertainty with the kind of diplomatic finesse that had initially caught Marshal's attention. He remained silent, focused on his duties, and avoided any action that could be interpreted as lobbying, aware that his own reputation hung in the balance. The internal friction of the command structure was managed in large part by his ability to bridge the gap between American industrial efficiency and the more cautious political approach of the British leadership. As the discussions finalized, the weight of the war's outcome was felt by every man in the room. The arguments were not just professional, they were existential. Marshal understood that if he pushed for the command and failed to receive it, the resulting tension could damage the Allied effort beyond repair. He subordinated his own ego, his ambition, and his lifelong dream to the necessity of the alliance. This was the ultimate realization of his code, that the mission, the stability of the war effort, and the success of his protege were more important than his own place in the history books. The culmination of these events left a lasting mark on the commanders involved. Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke eventually accepted the outcome with a level of professionalism that belied his profound disappointment, recognizing that the sheer magnitude of the American effort had fundamentally altered the nature of the alliance. Marshal, for his part, remained the quiet architect, continuing his work in Washington with the same stoicism he had displayed throughout his career. The decision was final, the course was set, and the massive, intricate preparations for the liberation of Europe proceeded under the guidance of the man who had been chosen not because he was the most ambitious, but because he was the most capable of maintaining the fragile unity of the coalition. The turning point was the private meeting on December 5, 1943, where the fate of the Overlord command was sealed. In that moment, the potential for Marshal to lead the greatest amphibious assault in history was set aside, not by the failure of his plans, but by the overwhelming success of his administrative leadership. The logistics of the war were so vast and the political entanglements so complex that his presence in the Pentagon was a strategic necessity that even his own desire for the field could not override. This was the defining pivot of the European theater, a decision based on the cold, hard realization that some men are too important to be used in the front lines, even if they desperately wish to be there. The execution of this decision required an extraordinary level of discipline from both men. Marshal had to personally communicate the shift in plans, ensuring that Eisenhower was fully aware of the trust being placed in him. Had the decision been made differently, had Marshal been allowed to take the command, the structure of the war effort in Washington might have faced a critical period of instability. The loss of his firm, administrative hand could have led to a breakdown in supply prioritization or a loss of focus in the Pacific theater, where the war was intensifying. The historical record suggests that the American machinery of war required his specific, detached analytical genius to continue the unprecedented pace of mobilization. Intelligence updates arriving in the final weeks of 1943 only reinforced Roosevelt's conclusion. The complexity of the German response, combined with the difficulty of coordinating an operation across multiple nations, convinced the political leadership that Eisenhower's temperament, which was well suited to the demands of a multinational coalition, was the ideal choice for the specific challenges of Normandy. The decision was not a slight against Marshal. It was the ultimate recognition of his indispensability. He was the architect of the victory, and he was expected to oversee its completion from the center of power. Consider the alternative. If Marshal had commanded, his direct, often blunt style might have clashed with the nuanced requirements of Allied diplomacy. While his strategic vision was superior, the necessity of maintaining the fragile cohesion of the British-American command structure under his leadership could have led to different, potentially less efficient outcomes. Instead, his presence in Washington ensured the steady, unrelenting flow of men and material that allowed the invasion to succeed on the scale that it did. The success of Normandy was not just a battlefield victory. It was a testament to the administrative genius that had kept Marshal in Washington, managing the global machine that made the liberation possible. History has overwhelmingly judged this decision as the correct one. Marshal's reputation was not diminished by his absence from the field, solidified as the man who was so essential that the war itself could not be managed without him. The post-war consensus among historians reflects this, focusing on the remarkable self-restraint and strategic vision he displayed. He did not become the hero of the landing, but he became the architect of the peace. His later work on the reconstruction of Europe further cementing his legacy as a man who understood the true nature of power and the sacrifice required to exercise it wisely. Chain of command tensions, once so raw, eventually faded into a narrative of professional admiration. Even those like Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, who had felt the weight of the decision personally, later acknowledged the strategic necessity of the American command structure. The burden of responsibility had been borne by Roosevelt, who had to reconcile the needs of the state with the ambitions of his best men. His decision to keep Marshal in Washington was not just a management choice. It was a testament to the trust he placed in his chief of staff, a trust that allowed the Allied forces to operate with the coherence required for total victory. The voices of subordinate officers, once ignored, became part of the post-war historical record, providing a more detailed view of the immense pressure that had existed behind the scenes. Their accounts emphasize the quiet, unwavering commitment of both Marshal and Eisenhower, and the unspoken acknowledgement that the leadership had made a choice for the sake of the mission. These memoirs and oral histories have served to humanize the high-stakes decisions that were made in the shadows of the Cairo and Tehran conferences, revealing a command structure that, while strained, was held together by a shared recognition of the gravity of the conflict. In resolving the mysteries of this decision, we find the answers. The command structure was saved by the restraint of a single man. The logistics of the global conflict were kept stable by the presence of a master organizer. And the political cohesion of the alliance was maintained by the deliberate choice to empower a proven bridge builder. The sacrifice of George Marshall was the foundation upon which the success of Overlord was built. It was a sacrifice that moved him away from the immediate glory of the battlefront, but it ensured the ultimate victory of the cause he had devoted his entire life to serving. The historical discourse continues as new scholarship periodically examines whether the war could have been shortened had Marshall been in Europe. Yet the consensus remains that his administrative brilliance in Washington was the irreplaceable engine of the entire Allied effort. The decision, painful as it may have been to the individual, was the correct decision for the war. It remains a profound example of leadership, illustrating that the greatest contribution often comes from the willingness to perform the necessary, even if it means stepping away from the dream you have worked a lifetime to achieve. The memory of this period, and the men who led us through it, serves as a permanent reference for the exercise of authority under pressure. We look back at the decisions made in Cairo and Tehran, not with the benefit of hindsight, but with an appreciation for the weight of the choices that were faced by men like Marshall and Roosevelt. Their story is one of profound commitment to a mission that transcended personal glory. It is a story that reveals the true character of leaders who understood that the survival of the world was at stake, and that the only thing that mattered was victory, nothing else. Imagine for a moment you are General George C. Marshall on that day in Cairo, sitting across from President Roosevelt. You have spent your entire career training for the singular opportunity to lead the greatest invasion in history, and now the president is subtly asking you to claim it. Do you push for the command you believe you deserve and know you can execute, potentially destabilizing the entire Allied war effort in the process? Or do you accept the president's request to stay in Washington, subordinating your personal ambition for the success of the mission? What would you have done? If you appreciate this deep dive into the human side of military command, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to join our community of history enthusiasts. We want to know your thoughts on this pivotal moment in the history of the Second World War.